Hi there. Today I want to talk to you about how to craft a research question. And I know there's some things in your books about that, but I really find that this is an area where students have problems, and it's absolutely crucial. I consider your research question to be like your rudder in the water and a really important guide to the work you're doing. So if your research question isn't clear, then you remain confused for the entire study that you're doing, and your research question really gets in your way rather than to help you to do the study. And I always tell students you need to make sure that you go back when you're analyzing your data and look at what your research questions were, because sometimes you can get really distracted by, oh, look, isn't that interesting? And you go off in this direction, wow, I didn't expect that, and you don't end up answering your research question. And you need to answer those, and that's what your committee is going to want. So I thought it would be helpful, and I have found this helpful in the past when I've worked with students in a qualitative course, to analyze some research questions so that you have some skills for looking at your own research question and crafting it in a way that makes it very, very doable and helpful to you, which is exactly what it should be. So in looking at research questions, and I haven't found this anywhere in a book, so I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it. There are several things you need to look for. One, is it a qualitative question? If you're going to do qualitative research, you want to know whether this question is qualitative or quantitative. And what I find is that students have quantitative research sort of embedded in their bones. And so they'll come into my office and they'll say, I want to do a qualitative study. And then they give me, I remember one student, I said, okay, write 10 questions. And he did, and all 10 of them were quantitative. So I don't recommend that you back into a research study by deciding on your method first, because really the method should follow the question. But you need to know when you've crafted a question whether you're going to be doing quantitative work or qualitative work. So that's the first question, is this a qualitative question or a quantitative question? Then secondly, what terms need to be defined? Because often there are terms in the question that would be confusing to the reader unless they are defined in some way. In other words, how are you using this particular term? And we'll do some examples so you'll get an idea of what I mean. But I think it's really important that you look at, one of the examples that I think that often comes up is people talk about exemplary principles or exemplary programs, and they want to study those. And that's a good thing to study, because you want to find out what makes this good? Why is it working so well? And how then can I duplicate that in my own situation? But how are you going to define exemplary? So often what students do, and I have a student that's doing this right now, is they go for award-winning people or programs, because those can be defined as exemplary. A student right now who's studying Asian American female school principals. And how is she going to find out which ones are the good ones? You don't want to study the bad ones. That is not helpful. Well, she picked Milken Award winners and all of the ones that are in Hawaii. So then you have a good definition for exemplary or for outstanding, whatever term you use. And then what assumptions are buried in the question? Often there are assumptions in the question, and often there are cause and effect assumptions that you can't have in there unless you can support those somehow. They have to be documented or proven in some way if you're going to state them. So let's look at some examples, and then you can think about your own question that you want to craft. So if there are flaws, then I want you to correct them in these questions on your research question worksheet. The first question is, which reading program performs best when administered to a third grade class over the course of a year? Okay, so the first thing we want to know is this a quantitative question or a qualitative question? So think about that for a minute. Which reading program performs best when administered to a third grade class over the course of a year? This is a quantitative question. You would have to measure the results of the reading programs and then decide which one was best according to the measurements. So you've got a quantitative question. That's not going to work in a qualitative course. Okay, second question. How does participation in ROTC improve scholastic performance? Is that quantitative or qualitative? Okay, again, I think this is a quantitative question because you're asking about the improvement of scholastic performance and you would have to measure that. You'd have to look at what's happening to their grades or whatever. Also, there are some terms that need to be defined. Participation, what does that mean? Scholastic performance, what does that mean? Are you going to just look at grades? Are you going to look at other things? Now, you could ask for self-reports. That would be one way to make it qualitative. You could interview people and say, okay, you were in RTC for a year. Do you think it improved your scholastic performance? And they could go, yeah, I think it did. But are we going to trust them? I mean, I still think you'd be better off if you measured what happened to their grades or something that you define as scholastic improvement or performance. So you would want then to define those terms. And also there's an assumption in here. Can you tell me what the assumption is? One of the assumptions, there may be more than one, is that it's a cause and effect assumption. Participation improves performance. I mean, maybe their performance went down because their grandmother died, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they were in ROTC. So you just don't want to make those kinds of assumptions. And what I've often told students to do is to ask, does participation in ROTC improve scholastic performance, and if so, how? So the first question is just, is this assumption even correct that that's possible? And then the second question would be, how does it improve? And that part, how does it improve, could be a more qualitative thing. Okay, third question. How do participants respond to effective student retention programs for freshmen at a large public university? This is a real question one of my students asked. How do participants respond to effective student retention programs for freshmen at a large public research university? Now this is an important question because institutions want to know how to retain their students. They don't want their students dropping out. So it's a useful question. At the same time, that how is a qualitative question. How do they respond? And how are you going to figure out how they respond? Well, you have to go talk to them, or you have to observe them, or you could do both, right? So that is definitely a qualitative question. Now, it does have some terms that need to be defined. Can you find a term in this question that you think needs definition? Well, you probably could take a clue from what I said earlier. I think the most important term, and there may be more than one, I mean, you got to define freshmen. Are you talking about, have they been in school for 2 years but they still have freshman standing? I mean, you have little things like that to figure out. But the most important term for you to define is effective. What is an effective student retention program? So you would have to decide, are you going to pick one that has won an award? Are you going to pick one that fits some criteria in the literature? You might find an article that says here are the sort of characteristics of an effective student retention program, and then say, does this program meet those characteristics? So there's several ways to do that, but you do have to define effective. Okay, next question. Does reflective writing improve what athletic training students are learning, both in the classroom and in the clinical setting? Does reflective writing improve what athletic training students are learning? And again, this is a question one of my students made up. both in the classroom and in the clinical setting. Now, first of all, do you think it's quantitative or qualitative? Well, we're having to measure, aren't we? Learning. And we're doing cause and effect. Reflective writing improves or impacts learning in some way. So I think it's mostly a quantitative question, unless again you wanted to go with self-report and ask students, well, do you think it improved your learning? But another big problem with this question is what is learning? You've got a real nebulous piece in here. What athletic training students are learning? And you would have to decide how you're going to define that. And you've got grades in the classroom, but in the clinical setting, well, maybe they get graded in the clinical setting too. But you can see that there's a lot here for you to think about in terms of, okay, what in this question do I need to think about and define? And then are there assumptions buried in the question? The last one is, again, a real question from one of my students. And this is long. In fact, it's 2 questions. But I think it's a really good example of a qualitative question. What knowledge, habits, and attitudes about sustainability do current community college students have? In other words, what do learners know, do, and feel about sustainability? And then where have they learned their current knowledge, habits, and attitudes about sustainability? In classrooms, on campus, in service learning, or from peers, home, K-12, or K-12 schools, or from newspapers. And then she has what instructional resources and processes influence student learning about sustainability. Now, these are good qualitative questions because we can't measure this. We have to ask them, what do you know? What do you do? And how do you feel about it? What are your attitudes? And then where did you learn this? Now, one of the reasons she wanted the second question is because the professors at the community college that she studied said, we have tried so hard to teach sustainability in the classroom, and that they wanted to know if students were getting it or not. So that was the reason where the second question came in. And she conducted focus groups in order to hear what the students had to say, and that was partly because she felt that they would maybe learn from each other or bounce off each other in the situation, and that they would be more comfortable than if you just stuck a poor community college freshman in front of a microphone and said, tell me what you know about sustainability. Just exactly make them comfortable. And one of the goals in an interview is to make people as comfortable as possible, because then you get better data. So she put them in a little group and said, what do you know? What do you do? What are your habits? And then how do you feel about it? And she got really good data with these questions. Now, why does she have these parentheses? What do learners know, do, and feel? And what instructional resources and processes influence student learning? And the reason is because she is incorporating her theoretical frame. And that's often a very good thing to do, is to use your theoretical frame to guide your work. And in her case, she had a curricular theoretical frame. It was about curriculum in higher education. And it had all these elements. It was a big drawing or figure, graph, whatever, that talked about how in curriculum you have all these things. You have what students know, you have what they do, and you have their attitudes. So she came up with some really interesting results, and she actually had a matrix, which I'll talk about a little later, of students who knew about sustainability and did it, students who knew about sustainability and didn't do it. I know about that stuff, but I always used to use paper bags or plastic bags from the store. I don't take my own bags or whatever. But the interesting part was she had students who didn't know about sustainability that were doing it. Now, how could you not know about it and do it? Well, in Hawaii, there are students who have gardens or who hunt wild pigs because they need the food. So they don't know anything about sustainability, but they're living sustainably. And I thought that was really interesting. And then they had, of course, students who didn't know anything about it and weren't doing anything about it. So we'll talk about those issues in analyzing data a little later, but if you look at these questions, what do you think is the key term that you would need to define? Because we talked about defining terms. And I would say sustainability is the key term here. You have to decide, what is that? What are you going to put in that sustainability box, and what are you going to leave out in terms of how that is defined? So she was able to do that quite easily. Okay.